All right, punctually at 7 p.m. Welcome everybody to the first online meeting of D-Linker Internationals. Today, before we begin with the actual meeting, if I could ask everybody to please either write or set their name on Jitsi. So you can do that by either clicking on your own little video screen and typing your name, or doing it in opening up the chat box, which will then allow you to type in your name. Or at the very least, when you do write into the chat, please write your name at the end so that I know who to talk to. So the way this is going to go today is that our speakers, Antony and Sohail, will both give a short input of about 3 minutes each. Then I will ask them a few questions, and then we'll open up the floor, the virtual floor, to everybody who is listening. So welcome to the meeting. You are able to send in questions throughout the entire course of the meeting. Please, but please don't speak until it's time for the Q&A, so that we can let our speakers give their presentations. So I'll just say a couple of words about why we're doing this and introduce the speakers to you. So the reason we're doing this meeting is, well, first of all, to not just talk about the coronavirus, but we said this meeting we decided on the topic of this meeting a few months ago now, knowing that the question of borders and citizenship is becoming more and more relevant in a very aggressive way. It's being used by states and very powerful figures to create divisions in various societies. I can see that Phil wants to say something. Phil, I think you can say something, Phil, if you want. You need to unmute yourself, though. No?
Don't say anything. Just something slipped.
Okay. All right. So where was I? Yeah. So this is why we decided to broadly talk about the question of citizenship and borders. We went through kind of a lot of options as to what geographical or contextual areas we wanted to focus on, and we settled on talking about the Windrush deportations in the UK, which kind of gained heat in the country over the last year with a new wave of deportations and some pretty scandalous behaviors from various politicians, and also very recently published report just, I think, 4 days ago, which obviously has gone a bit which didn't resonate as much as perhaps it would normally, because obviously there's only one news topic at the moment. And for a similar reason, why we decided to talk about India is that, of course, the protests gained huge momentum in the recent months, and obviously now with the virus and curfews, everything has been kind of swept under a rug. And in both cases, governments are trying to divide people based on lines of either religion or ethnicity. And we thought this is actually a very pertinent thing, and also a very good thing to keep talking about while we're all dealing with the pandemic. So the two speakers today are Antony Hamilton, who is in our LAG, and he is an anti-racist activist from the UK who now lives in Berlin and is also the author of A Rebel's Guide to Malcolm X. And Jagat Sohail, who is a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at Princeton University, who is working on migration and exile. Specifically in Berlin, he's working with refugees for his PhD research, and he's been involved with Berlin for India, through which he's been trying to mobilize support to pressure the far-right Indian government over the persecution of religious minorities and the suppression of dissent. And there have been quite a few very successful protests that have happened in Berlin thanks to this very new group. So so just to remind the speakers, you have to unmute yourself. Me and Tom don't have that power. So Antony, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. I wanted to start with a little bit of a background of the British situation and basically why it matters that we're having this meeting today, because I think right now it kind of feels like the world is in turmoil. And obviously the major question on everyone's lips is about the coronavirus, but there's a lot of other stuff that's going on right now that is still carrying on under the radar because, like Hannah said, the main news topic and the only news topic really is the coronavirus. But if we look at the way in which racism has been affected over the last 5 years or so, how it's used as a weapon, how refugees and so have been treated, it's quite important actually to recognize the impact of that, especially with what's going on today. In the last 5 or 10 years, especially since the financial crisis, the blame of the collapse of the system, of lack of resources, of overpopulation, all these sorts of things have been put on immigrants, Muslims, refugees, anyone who looks like they might be, and thereby diverting attention away from the bosses, from people in power, from bankers and the people who essentially put us in this situation in the first place. But what this means is that the questions of identity, of nationality, of national pride and patriotism have all become major factors dominating pretty much every political question in recent years, and especially so in Britain. If we take the polarization of the Brexit vote, the debates that formed the groundwork for that, it was people like Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, who was given an abundance of platforms compared to other political commentators, and he was using those platforms to preach hate and preach division. And of course, this has had real tangible effects. It not only boosts the confidence of racists on the ground who are carrying out racist attacks and so on, but it also permeates into parliamentary politics and has managed to pull the entire political spectrum to the right. We have Boris Johnson, who's the current Prime Minister, who was able to get away with saying that Muslim women look like letterboxes, that black children are pickaninnies. And, for a politician who is now leading the country to be able to say those things and not actually ever apologize, not ever to say that anything that he said was wrong, anything could incite violence or anything like that, is absolutely disgraceful. But it shows how much the right wing have been able to dominate politically in terms of leading policy, in terms of leading the political direction of Parliament. What this means for ordinary people, and especially what I'll talk about now, the Windrush generation, is there's been a sudden wave of uncertainty, of a new precarious way of life. People who've lived their entire lives in Britain, made families, grew up through generations, worked numerous jobs, built communities, are suddenly told that they don't belong in the country anymore. And this has been an incredibly traumatic experience for a lot of people. It's also groundbreaking in terms of who it is, who the government gets to decide who belongs there. And so I'll quickly just explain who the Windrush Generation are. In 1948, it was the Empire Windrush was a ship which was sailing from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, and it was taking with it groups of migrants who were coming to Britain essentially to start a new life. It both encouraged and pushed away at the start. Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister at the time, actually tried to divert the ship away from Britain. But the idea of migration, of wanting to find a better source of life, of work and employment and so on, has always been the sort of chase of ordinary people to try and find a new place to live and a new place to work. But those people who came over, who travelled over during the Windrush generation, they built their lives in the UK. They built industry, like the National Health Service, the railroads, the buses, and so on. They became a really fundamental element of British society. What happened really recently with the Windrush generation really started around 2010 with the ramping up of the Immigration Act. And this is really put down to Theresa May. In 2010, Theresa May became the Home Office, the Secretary for the Home Office. And what she immediately did was bring in the 2010 Immigration, sorry, not the 2010 Immigration Act. What she immediately did actually was send out more than 170,000 texts, which said that they were a message from the UK Border Agency, which said they were required to leave the UK as they no longer have a right to remain. In that same year, they sent round racist vans, which said "Go home" on the side of them, and these were sent round to cities and towns across the UK. all the branding for the Home Office vehicles was replaced with the words immigration enforcement, and the entire ideology essentially became around trying to find immigrants which they deemed not legally allowed to live in the UK anymore. This obviously has an incredibly traumatic effect. It didn't have much of a physical effect in actually deporting people, but it has a much more physical effect in making people feel like they don't belong and encouraging that racist atmosphere as well. This is what was coined the hostile environment. During her time, the Tories pushed through the Immigration Act of 2014, which meant that people who lived in Britain for decades found they didn't have the required documentation which legally allowed them to live there anymore. From this, the government issued vouchers based on perceived employability of migrants. So the Immigration Act essentially turned bosses, landlords, public sector bodies into border guards to make life harder for either recent immigrants or people who've lived in the country for generations who were suddenly told that they didn't belong there anymore. And this is incredibly racially driven because all it did was encourage people to look out for people who might look illegal. It was essentially racially profiling. It was encouraging people to look for Black people, for people whose English wasn't their first language, and so on. And obviously, when the hostile environment policy was working well, it exhausted people into submission. It piled up humiliation, stress, and fear until people gave up. And this has meant that over the last decade, tens of thousands of people have been deported, and many are still fighting for justice and compensation, with very few being heard. Hannah said earlier that it has been a long way, but an official report was released last week, which stated in the report that the Tories' treatment of the Windrush generation, let me find the exact quote, the Tories' treatment of the Windrush generation migrants was consistent with some elements of institutional racism. So, I mean, this was something which people have been fighting for a very long time. But again, this is something that slipped under the radar because of obviously what's been happening in recent weeks. But of course, this official proof doesn't mean, while it proves that what happened was unjust, it doesn't mean that all the victims have received justice. One report doesn't undo the years of racist rhetoric, which has been absorbed and weaponized by various institutions, groups, individuals, politicians, and so on. And I think this has really been part of a reshaping of British society over the last 10 years or so, to constantly find new scapegoats, new people to blame for an ongoing financial and political crisis, which the Tories have really struggled to try and contain. If anyone does want to find out more information specifically about the Windrush generation, there is a great documentary which is called The Unwanted, The Secret Windrush Files, which is available online. It's by a guy called David Olusoga, and that goes through a lot more of the details, specific cases, people who've been affected by it, and so on. But I think I'll leave it there just for my introduction. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Antony, for the great introduction to that. I'll ask a few questions, but now if we could hand it over to Sohail for his introduction.
Hi. So yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for having me. So I guess, I'll kind of do a quick introduction of kind of what's been going on in India. So essentially, since about December last year, India has seen what have been essentially the largest kind of pan-India protests, and certainly international as well, that the country has seen in upwards of 30 years. And how that came to be is essentially two decisions made by the current ruling far-right Hindu nationalist government in India. So the first is the decision made in November to institute a nationwide NRC, or a National Register of Citizens, with the kind of explicit goal to weed out all infiltrators and illegals. Now, the kind of second aspect of this is something called what's now called the Citizenship Amendment Act. Now, under the Citizenship Amendment Act, essentially for the first time in India's history, religion was introduced as a kind of determining category for citizenship. And so under this act, if you were determined to be a non-Muslim immigrant from Afghanistan, Pakistan or Bangladesh and have been in India since essentially before 2015, then you would get expedited and pretty much guaranteed citizenship from the Indian state. Now, as it stands, there's very good grounds, and many have argued that the CAA itself is kind of unconstitutional and goes against certainly the kind of secular principles laid out in the Indian Constitution at inception. And while in and of itself there would be a kind of good case to be made for why people need to kind of be out on the streets protesting the introduction of religion as a kind of motivating criteria for citizenship in India. Really what makes it a lot worse, and this is kind of where things get a little bit tricky, is the way that it's meant to do both. So the NRC, and I mean here there's I think some parallels to the Windrush Generation, except in this situation it kind of functions for the entire country. The NRC requires people to provide documentation essentially as evidence that they're Indian citizens. Now, the kind of crucial aspect in this is that existing national forms of identification like passports, voter identification cards, and even the kind of national identification card, which in India is called the Aadhaar card, wouldn't essentially work. And what you need to provide, and kind of we have, and this isn't hypothetical, I mean, this has already happened in one state in India, in Assam, in the Northeast. And so what we know from that experience is what you'd be expected to provide essentially are birth certificates for yourself, and very often, and again, this depends a little bit on age brackets, but also for your parents, and of course, property documentation. Now, to give you a sense of how unlikely it is that people will be able to provide this, if you are under the age of 5 right now in India, there's a 40% chance that your birth wasn't registered, that essentially you don't have a birth certificate. And of course, as you can imagine, this number kind of gets significantly worse if you were born before 2005. So, and of course, with property, I mean, the same thing goes. I mean, this would kind of make it impossible for the very large section of India's kind of landless population to be able to furnish any kind of documentation, and also women who kind of get who very often, because of the kind of way inheritance has tended to work in India, will not have property, certainly not registered to their name. And so the expectation, and again, this is something that we kind of know from experience in Assam, the expectation is that hundreds of millions of people will fall through the cracks of the NRC. So in Assam, currently, that figure, despite the kind of amended list that they just put out, is still about 2 million people. And the CAA was essentially introduced as a corrective. And this is something that the Home Minister made clear in a kind of statement that he gave in Parliament, where the kind of understanding was that those that were left out of the NRC because of the kind of lack of documentation would then be able to apply through the CAA to regain their citizenship. In other words, what this would mean, and this is, I mean, it sounds a little strange, and this is one of the harder aspects of kind of trying to explain this quickly, is that if you were, let's say, a North Indian Hindu that lived in Delhi, you would, that's lived in Delhi for generations, but didn't have any documentation to prove it. Let's say, birth certificates and property ownership proof. You would essentially have to then, once you've been left out of the NRC, file through the CAA a claim that you were, let's say, a Bangladeshi Hindu immigrant, and on that ground, you would be given back your citizenship. So, in no uncertain terms, I mean, this is kind of, there are two steps of kind of ethnic cleansing that the BJP is kind of, that BJP is a kind of ruling far-right party in India is planning. The first step relies on kind of inconsistent documentation in the country, which is a kind of well-known fact, to disenfranchise very large sections of India's population. And in the second, through the CAA, the understanding is that all but the undesirable identities will then be reabsorbed into the Indian body politic. And so essentially this is this kind of and this is a move that's been that they've essentially been planning. It's in their party manifesto. It's a kind of statement that we've kind of we've got indications that that's essentially exactly the plan. Not just indications, we've got kind of confirmed statements from BJP ministers about this stuff. But the thing that I think is important to make clear in all of this, and the kind of direction in which maybe I'll talk a little bit later, is that the idea, whatever else, so the BJP has tried in many ways to imply that Muslims don't belong to the kind of, this is a far-right Hindu nationalist speak, that they in some sense don't belong to the nation. But the idea of Muslims as migrants in India should really be understood to be completely nonsensical. India is home to the second largest population of Muslims in the world, with 177 million Muslims, most of whom have lived in the country, certainly in the subcontinent, for several generations. And so the idea of a certain kind of ethnic exclusion through the categories and language of citizenship and kind of bureaucracy and legality is really something new. And this is the kind of question that I think needs to be examined a little bit more. Why take this path? Why use the language of citizenship? Why use the kind of vocabulary of legal and illegal, which up until now in India has kind of been very out of place to describe and to kind of to create this mechanism of exclusion. And I guess I'll stop here, but essentially the case that I wanted to make is kind of with regards to that, and with regards to the kind of the things that the BJP is trying to do to build a certain kind of global coalition around this increasingly homogenized or homogenous notion of Islamophobia in the world. Anyway, I'll stop. Sorry, I've kind of gone on a little too long, so I'll just stop there for now. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much for your input. I guess maybe the first question was, that I will ask both of you, just coming off from what you've just said, is that why take this route of citizenship, doing it through kind of the legal structures of each country? Why is documentation so important? Because at the end of the day, both the Windrush generation and Muslims in India haven't had to be confronted with the idea of nationhood until now, until it's being questioned. You both of you have mentioned that a lot of people who are being affected by these two situations don't have the right documentation to prove their belonging to a legal entity, which is the state of India or the United Kingdom. So my question here is about kind of this idea of renationalizing each of the countries or each of the nation states, and how they're kind of using certain set of values. And why do you think they are? I mean, obviously there's a very obvious answer here, but I think I would like to know more, and hopefully others too, as to why do you think they're taking that very route on both, in both situations, and what do they really want to do? Because sure, with the Windrush problem or the issue, they obviously would like to deport a lot of them, but what does the Indian government want to do with the Muslim population? And why is this route the route that they want to be taking? So maybe take it from there.
Right.
Either of you.
Should I kind of
go for it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, this is really. I mean, the way that I look at it, I think this is. Well, I mean, certainly there's a kind of reinvention of nationalism, and that's kind of happening across the world, and that's something that's happening here. It's certainly happening in Europe and kind of elsewhere. But the other thing that's happening, I think, is a kind of alliances that this language allows. I mean, the 20th century technology of ethnic violence really relied also on a vocabulary of migration, but it was a kind of very different kind of vocabulary of migration. It was this kind of ancient migration. So if you think of the kind of notion of Aryanness in Germany, but also if you look at the way that this kind of old colonial anthropology notion of migration works to define inside-outside, in the way that it plays out in the Rwandan genocide, where through kind of French colonial anthropology, this notion that Tutsis came from somewhere else originally because of kind of ethnic difference, and this is the logic that they were able to provide, then became eventually the primary kind of mechanism through which genocidal violence was organized. And certainly this has happened in India before. I mean, this kind of older discourse around immigration. I think what the newer immigration discourse allows is, well, it's a more efficient technology of violence. When you can, and so right now in India, there are kind of massive detention camps being built. And so when you can essentially detain and deport instead of actively killing, I think that's what they've picked up from kind of especially Euro-American practices of kind of borders and bureaucracy, is that ends up being a much more efficient way through which to ethnically cleanse than to have to mobilize the kind of ideological, not that they're unwilling to do that, but to have to mobilize the kind of ideological authority to kind of actively call for genocidal violence. And in many ways, I think this is the difference between the movement from the concentration camp to the detention camp, right? So the concentration camps were defined essentially around identities, whether it's a kind of, whether it's in the Holocaust, but also with kind of Japanese Americans in the US. And of course, detention camps get to work under the veneer of legality and get to essentially play that game, for the lack of a better word, and to be and under the kind of mask of legality, they're able to actually conduct a kind of violence that's far harder to far less open to kind of international scrutiny. But really, I think the reason that India is picking up this language is because Europe has this language, and it allows a certain kind of alignment between Indian far-right fascists and kind of white nationalists in the West, where they're able to kind of nudge each other the Indian far right is able to say, well, just like you guys, we have this problem with Muslim immigration, and we need to get rid of all the illegals. And really, if you look at some of the kind of far right discourse in the West in terms of how they've covered the CANRC, it's there's a lot of, India has the right idea, right? I mean, they're doing, this is what we should be doing, and so on. Which again, like I said, should make absolutely no sense in the Indian context. But I think it's those alignments between this kind of broader the kind of global Islamophobic right that kind of motivate in many ways the ideological shifts that India is trying to make, or certainly the far right in India is trying to make, with this turn to citizenship as opposed to this kind of older notion of belonging.
Antony, do you want to say something on the UK side?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this entire sort of language, it's all, really, it's all ideological. It doesn't actually make sense to deport this many people, especially people who've not only built their entire lives in a country, but actively contribute to a country. If you look at like the proportion of NHS nurses and so on, like you'll find that migrants make up a huge section of British society, especially within the Windrush generation. To suddenly decide that you're going to deport and isolate so many, really, I think is an ideological point about who it is who gets to decide who belongs somewhere. It's that us versus them mentality. And I think who gets to decide who's a citizen is really important. Recently we've seen the British government take complete control over whether or not someone is allowed to be considered British, not just in Windrush, but I'm going to take one specific case on, which was quite famous, was the case of Shamima Begum, who was a school pupil when she left the UK to join ISIS at 15. She fled to return to the UK and was stripped of her citizenship, left essentially with no rights and no home. And regardless on anyone's position on like what it is that she went to do and so on, for a government to have that power to be able to remove your rights on a whim is incredibly dangerous and can be used as a political weapon against people who oppose them, especially if you wrap this up together with the Conservatives, the Tories promoting this idea of British values about what it is to be British, and at the same time listing a lot of people who oppose their ideology on a list which counter-terrorism police use to identify non-violent terrorism organizations. On this list of non-violent terrorists are people like Stand Up to Racism, Stop the War Coalition, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, people who oppose the Tory policies ideologically, but have become essentially enemies of the state. And I think this is where a lot of this language leads. It's a concerted effort by people in power to consistently create an us versus them situation, so that there's always an enemy rather than those at the top, and citizenship is a part of that. But it's not been around forever. This is absolutely like a capitalist development, and it's something which we see time and time again. I could go on and talk about racism in more details, but I don't know if you want to ask more questions first.
Sure. I mean, actually, as we're talking about language, I was wondering if you could both expand a little bit on what kind of values are both the far right movements in both Britain and India trying to kind of put forward, and especially I'm quite interested in more Sohail just said about why is India so interested in picking up the language that is being used or is quite prevalent in Europe in terms of Islamophobia, and what it is that they're trying to gain from this. Is it just international alliances? Is it just some sort of claim to, because of course Islamophobia is it's a global problem in that, of course it's happening also in China, it's happening also in Myanmar, it's across the world. The people are kind of, it's the phobia of the day in the worst possible sense. But I think I'll be quite interested to know if you think there's more to it from the Indian side, or whether it is just about kind of being there in like this global alliance. And also in the UK, of course, the Windrush is against Black people who came from the West Indies in the 40s. But it's presumably this is part of a much bigger kind of act of kind of racialized kind of legal violence, or against people who are effectively British citizens. So I just wondered if you could both expand on the kind of the language and the context of both those things. I hope that made sense. And don't mind which one of you starts if you have an answer.
Yeah, so maybe I'll kind of just quickly. So I think essentially there are two. The history of the figure of the Muslim, so to speak, is kind of twofold. There's one history which is the imperialist history, and one which is a kind of colonial one, and they're kind of defined to a certain degree by the American and the European kind of histories with Islam. And again, there's a very large amount of overlap, and that's why it's kind of useful to speak of the West as a category occasionally. But essentially, the kind of American figure of the Muslim was the Muslim as terrorist, right? And the kind of European figure of the Muslim was through the colonial experience as Muslim as immigrant. And the thing about the thing that kind of like is really interesting, and you mentioned Myanmar as well. In South and Southeast Asia, this would not have been legible until very recently. So in India, we kind of completed, and this is part of essentially the Hindu rights attempt, and it's part of a trend starting in the 90s to increasingly globalize. And one of the things that really helps the globalization of Hindutva, which is kind of a far-right Hindu ideology, is this presence of this kind of global figure of the Muslim. And so the first transition to this, so we used to actually, I remember growing up, we would always call this communalism. It was always understood as a kind of a regional conflict between religious groups in the subcontinent, right? Islamophobia described something else. Like I said, it described on the one hand the kind of American security state, and on the other hand the European kind of border regime, right? Now the first kind of transition that the BJP was able to make to the Indian Muslim as terrorists was kind of achieved in the first decade of the 21st century. And this is kind of what I really think that the CANRC is attempting to do, which is to make the second transition and align to a certain extent with European far-right interests. And so I think it's not really just a question of, really the language. If you look at what Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar was able to do with Rohingya Muslims, and Rohingya Muslims have lived for centuries in Myanmar as Muslims, and really it followed. She followed exactly the same pattern. Her claim is that Rohingya Muslims are all immigrants from Bangladesh, Muslim immigrants from Bangladesh, and she frequently. So I think it was 2 years ago, she met with Hungary's Viktor Orban, and they released a joint statement after the meeting together, saying both their countries kind of stand together, united against Muslim immigration, and it's a new. It's not just a new vocabulary. Certainly, it is that, but it's a new technology of exclusion, right? It's far easier to detain, deport than it is to actually organize, I think, the mass-scale violence of 20th century genocide. Again, certainly they would be willing to do both those things, and in Myanmar we've seen that happen as well. But a large part of what I think they see to gain in the migration discourse is simply the efficiency of this kind of technology of exclusion. And I think that the right everywhere is extremely opportunistic. The BJP was able to kind of switch from being ardent supporters of kind of Hitlerism and, of course, Mussolini's fascism and so on, to using Israel as its and kind of Israeli Zionism as a kind of point of inspiration. So really, they're very kind of opportunistic, and they're able to pick up on and read, essentially, I think, the kind of technologies that these new bureaucratic regimes of legality allow So that's essentially what I think is happening. That on the one hand, yes, it allows them in language to align globally. That we're all speaking the same language, and yes, just we all have this issue with Muslims. But on the other hand, I think what it really does and is acknowledge that it's much easier to bury people under bureaucracy, to have them languish in detention camps, to have them starve, to have them not receive medical attention, and to basically have them let die as opposed to actively kill them. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I don't know if Antony have anything to add on. I mean, of course, a lot of the Windrush generation were also kept in detention centers, immigration detention centers for a long time. A lot of them have been sent back, have now died, being back in Jamaica particularly. So I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about that aspect of things, or the language that is used by the British government to kind of exclude them on this level as well. So
yeah, I'll say something more about the language, because the concept of British values especially is quite interesting, because really they don't actually exist and are incredibly subjective. If you've seen any politician ever talk about what it is to have British values, they make a sort of generalization about this sort of like beauty of, British liberalism and all that sort of stuff. But really where those ideas of British values came from is from racist and exclusionary measures. They came out of the Prevent agenda, which was really about isolating Muslims as a fifth pillar within British society, and making Muslims the ones who were essentially othered, essentially made to feel like an other group that existed within society. And you can see how this sort of language, this sort of rhetoric can be started and tested and used on one group of people and then rolled out to actually all sorts of different other minorities. And so, I mean, if you were to say British values to anyone really in Britain, they wouldn't really know what to say. Like, it could be, a joke about tea and biscuits and all that sort of stuff. Or it could be talking about imperialism and the values of the British Empire, and actually how it was one of the most bloody empires in human history that went around colonizing half the world. And it's quite ironic, really, that the people that they colonize are the people who are there. They are telling that they are not British anymore, that they don't belong anymore. Well, it was the British who actually went to their countries in the first place, well, who stole them from their countries, took them to a new country, and are now rejecting them from being able to live freely. And this also ties into the idea of European values, because I think there's a much bigger ideological shift going on over the last 5 years, which, if you look at the sort of refugee crisis, highlights it quite a lot in terms of values over race, like faith over skin color and so on, although skin color becomes like a fundamental part in how you identify, someone as Muslim and so on when it comes to physical attacks. But you see this sort of shift in the language that's being used and so on. And I think this really ties into the ideas of national unity as well, of like governments trying to win a certain section of the working class to their side so that it makes our side weaker, essentially. National unity isn't about being proud of where you come from. National unity means uniting with bosses over workers who are in the same position of you, but just because they speak a different language, practice a different faith, have a different color of skin and so on, you believe that you have more in common with your boss, with the government, than you do with your colleague and your neighbor and so on. And this can create an incredibly toxic environment. What is good about the UK situation actually is to see the backlash, which this has sort of had, the support which the Windrush generation received from tens of thousands of people all across the UK who went out in demonstrations, had quite a major impact into the press. And partly this is because of the impact in which migrants have in society. Like, migrants aren't an extra pillar in society that just sort of exists, that are, they're not the people who are taking benefits, who are, draining the NHS and all these lies which the government, like people like Boris Johnson, tell. And they're people who are embedded into society at every single level. And I think it's quite inspiring actually to see the resistance that's been going on, and the fact that they've been able to get that report published. The difficulty now is to make sure that this report is mainstream and that this language can be challenged in a much bigger way so that it doesn't carry on just moving from different group to different minority group and so on.
Yeah, thank you both. I have one more question before I would open up to the floor, and that's maybe I don't know if the word is nice that we haven't been talking about the coronavirus, but maybe yeah, anyway, I don't know what the right word is, but I would like to ask you both what you think this kind of pandemic might do, how it might affect the current situation in both countries, whether it's going to help the far-right cause, do you think it's going to hinder it actually, or do you think it's going to have no effect at all?
I mean, I can say a little bit maybe. Oh, do you want to go first, Sohail?
No, go for it, please. Go for it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, in terms of the coronavirus, it's an interesting one because since really the start of it, there's been an element of racism permeating through pretty much all of it. You know, Donald Trump constantly refers to it as the Chinese virus. He doesn't refer to it as another virus. He's specifically trying to use it for political gain. And we see that in terms of like things which are shared on Facebook and Instagram and so on about, you know, like these people over there eating different foods, like, you know, things that make us all ill and it's, you know, all their sort of fault and stuff. But I think this has quite a concrete quite a concrete impact on the way in which racism, or the way in which we can view how racism permeates sort of every element of society. And I think structurally this matters as well, because if you look at the fact that borders are being shut, while this is, you know, you can see the sort of positives in terms of being able to monitor a population to see where it's being spread and so on. This also makes it much more difficult for people who are stuck in refugee camps on the borders outside of Europe. It also makes it incredibly difficult for, you know, people who've managed to make it into countries who are now living as migrants or living as refugees in countries to be able to go about their daily business and so on. For example, in Germany, there's now, if you're in I think it's more than 2 people, you need to be constantly carrying around with you a passport, you know, proof of ID, a proof of address, and so on. And if people are struggling to get into the country and then to get hold of these sorts of things, you can see how barriers are already coming into place, which can make it much more difficult for ordinary people. So I think it will have an impact. I don't think it necessarily will automatically mean that the right wing will benefit. I think really what matters is what we do as the left in reacting to it. I think this is already a good sort of setup, the idea that we can keep on meeting, even though we're all like in self-isolation now, we can actually still keep on talking about this. And I think that's incredibly productive. And I think we need to keep on building on that, definitely, because we can't allow the right wing to basically use this as a political weapon. This needs to be an opportunity to actually show the good in people and to show that people are coming together in solidarity, to say that, you know, like, even though this is a pandemic, even though there's a sort of crisis going on right now, we can all still be human to each other.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo, I mean, I completely agree with what Antony was saying, and just to kind of echo some of that, I mean, I think there's this liberal notion, you know, oh, this is a crisis, this isn't the time for politics, and so on. I mean, I think the right, certainly in India, but I suspect kind of pretty much everywhere, is looking at this as a potential moment for kind of you know, consolidation of power. And that's so for in the Indian case, I mean, the momentum that these kind of national protests had gathered, you know, we were all kind of watching on, and I think most of us that were kind of watching had this sense that something was going to snap, and it did. And so the BJP kind of organized a pogrom, essentially, a kind of anti-Muslim pogrom in Delhi, where you know, 49 people were killed, about 20 Muslim religious sites were vandalized and destroyed, and you know. And this was very kind of obviously kind of motivated by BJP ministers and so on, and several kind of invisible actors that we still don't really know what kind of happened, because of how much any kind of investigation has been shut down, and of course the police was complicit and so on. But despite the kind of violence that had been organized to get these protests to stop, they didn't. And really, that's kind of I think it showed just how remarkable the kind of momentum and perseverance of the protesters in this moment was, and you know, particularly of this squatter community of Muslim women, or these Muslim women that essentially squatted this area in Delhi and had been essentially there since mid-December. You know, and remarkably, they kind of continued to stay. And one of the things that the coronavirus has done is it's kind of turned liberals, and certainly the right, of course, against people that kind of these women, of course, on the one hand, but also people that have kind of continued to try to organize protests. And so essentially what they couldn't achieve, as far as the right is concerned, through organized violence against protesters and Muslims, they've been essentially able to, they've been kind of able to achieve that. Well, not, but it's happened thanks to the corona. It's a kind of a weird thing to say, but certainly it's happened because of the coronavirus now, in that a lot of the movement has lost its momentum. And again, so in that regard, to kind of echo what Anthony was saying, I think we need to recognize that this is certainly a moment in which the right is going to try to consolidate power. And there are many in the right that see this as a gift, certainly in India, especially to be able to use emergency, powers, etc., to be able to to restructure certain aspects of society. But equally, we, I think, need to be aware that like Antony said, this is a real moment where we're kind of experimenting with new technologies, perhaps with also with new forms of protests and new ways to pressure governments. And I think it's definitely also therefore something that we should look at as a certain kind of opportunity, where we need to fundamentally restructure the way our economies are kind of built, and the way that those that are the most marginalized, who are now being called upon the most to actually do all the essential work and stuff, need to be given a certain kind of worker security and so on. But yeah, definitely with kind of everything Antony said.
Great, thank you very much. I think that will conclude the more official part of this online meeting. And so I would now invite you all to either use the hand button in the bottom left corner to say that you'd like to speak, to either give a short input about anything you might like. If your name is fellow Jitsa, if you wouldn't mind changing your name so that I know who to ask to speak, that would be really great. Otherwise, yeah, and if you have any questions, that is also a good time. And particularly, we would probably love to hear from somebody who has more direct experience of racism in German citizenship policy. Like, I can say just a little bit in that. I mean, of course it is, as it is in any nation state. And Germany, while Germany's tries to present itself as somewhere as a nation state which is quite inclusive, of course, it does actually exclude huge amounts of people, particularly, in terms of their citizenship law is actually very stringent in the sense that you are not allowed to be German and something else. And the only reason that that is allowed is that the EU forced that to be something that the German state had to accept. So when you try to become German, it's you're German or nothing else, or German and European as in from the EU, which obviously creates a lot of questions about the fact that there's an idea of Germanness being the one thing that you can belong to, but you can't be that plus something, which in itself is very complicated, and particularly as there is still a law, I believe, when at the age of, I think, 18, the German-Turkish population has to choose, or a person of Turkish origin who is German has to choose which citizenship they would like to keep, German or Turkish, which is kind of insane. So that's a very brief thing that I can say about the German side. I have seen that a fellow Jitsa would like to speak. I don't know who that is, so maybe if you could just speak.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
It's Hari Kumar. First of all, I want to thank both of you for a very good outline of some really serious issues confronting the left. I want to talk about united fronts and get your ideas on both of those, both in Britain, but also more especially in India. There was a long history of divide and rule between Hindu and Muslim. And what I found heartening, Sohail, recently was very large united fronts of secularists plus Hindu and Muslims. How do you both see these sort of playing out, whether in India or in Britain? Thank you.
I think Phil wanted to speak next as well. Just yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to speak now, or do they want to answer the question? So
Answer the question, but it's because it disappeared, so that I don't forget to say that. So you can speak after.
I just wanted to say something about what we're saying about what coronavirus will affect. And I think it's right to say there are good and bad possibilities. Just a simple example that like a lot of people, I've joined a number of help groups, which are generally have left liberal politics, which are generally people who are worried about race and want to do something. And there was a post in there just today with someone saying, look, coronavirus is going to mean an economic crisis. It's going to mean that the bosses are going to profit and that we're going to lose out. And that means everybody needs to buy British and everybody needs to go on holiday in Britain. And I think it's a number of things. And one, it's what people said, in some cases, nationalism has replaced racism for some people, that it's that sort of, the person who posted that would be actually explicitly said, look, we want to support British industry, whether Muslim or Hindu or Christian, whether white. So, but it's still this concept of us and them, and I think there's a general misunderstanding of why racism happens and why it's there. That racism as an idea is a few bad ideas in a few people, generally poor people, working class people, and the way in which we stop racism is by educating people. Now I'll try. One, I don't think that explains the racism of Boris Johnson, to say it's just uneducated people. But also, this is the way in which racism has been continually used since slavery as a method of division. It's not just people suddenly come to the idea of being racist. It's systematically used. And what we're seeing in India and what we're seeing in Britain, it isn't just a few bad policies. It is a systematic attempt to divide people, which leads to people like the person in this group saying, oh, we need to protect my people about the other people, while at the same time being a clear anti-racist.
Okay, are you guys happy to respond to both the questions or the comments?
Yeah, United. So I think it's quite an important point because, I mean, I'm quite recent to Berlin, but when I was in the UK, I was an activist for quite a while and a member of numerous United Fronts in the UK against the far right, some of them like Stand Up to Racism, Unite Against Fascism. And I think this is something which kind of made Britain a little bit more unique than the rest of the EU in the sense of how you fight back against the far right, because there's a sort of like that dual element of you need the mass movement, you also need the people in sort of more powerful positions who are able to pass policy or able to, like lead unions and so on. If you look at the sort of landscape of the European Union over the last, or just Europe over the last, maybe the last decade or more, you'll see like the growth of far-right parties making it into parliaments, the likes of Golden Dawn, the Swedish Democrats, Jobbik, and also all these other sort of different far-right parties who actually made it into very, very powerful positions. And it's only been in quite recent years, especially over the last year or so, that many of these have started to be challenged in a much, much bigger way. In the UK, you didn't necessarily have that when you had, the British Nationalist Party, or you had the English Defence League, or you had Britain First, or even when Pegida tried to come to set up in the UK, every single time they were faced by not only people in the street, but also people in positions of power who were a part of that united front, a part of that wider movement, who were able to say that those sorts of people aren't welcome there. So you never had the same sort of fascist elements in Parliament, in positions of influence and so on, especially when you're able to shut down those sorts of platforms. I think the unique problem, though, that Britain had is that there wasn't a strong enough left to be able to step into that space once the far right has been pushed down, that there is a strong enough left to be able to actually step into that space and say this is where we need to go instead, compared to the rest of the EU. But I think that's all I've got to say about the British situation. The United Front is an incredibly important tool in terms of resisting the far right.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in and say, I mean, I think, with respect to the United Front, it's absolutely true. And one of the kind of remarkable things I think about the movement in India has been really the way that it's been imagined as a real kind of national movement with the goal to really fight for a kind of idea of India as this kind of secular state and so on. And it's really the sheer scale of it and the kind of and that's something that we've seen extend over all the way into the kind of Delhi pogroms, where some of the kind of most important stories that came out of the riots, the anti-Muslim riots, were the way that Sikh and Hindu neighbors would often provide protection in certain in neighborhoods, and would kind of all get together to make sure that their Muslim neighbors were safe. That's absolutely true. I think that we're in this kind of unique moment where the idea of India, I think we've had many protests, we've had many kind of social movements in India for a very long time, but none of them have really kind of involved this kind of large-scale imaginative potential. And in that sense, I think there's really something, and maybe again here to echo what Antony is saying, is I think we're in this position where there really needs to be some kind of left-wing leadership that's able to kind of step in, because right now we don't really have, in many ways, an opposition party, I mean, and this has been the kind of big problem. We haven't had a kind of strong will. We've had regional parties that have done really, really well, but what we haven't had is this kind of national imagination for what an opposition looks like. And really, I mean, the left in India used to be extremely powerful. Used to kind of have, at the very least, certain kind of zones of influence, and it's something that they've abandoned over the last kind of 2 decades. And it's something that I think, if not now, I'm not sure when else would be a better opportunity to invest in that kind of national leadership. So yeah, I mean, and I think this moment has been really full of that kind of potential.
Great, thank you both, and thank you for the comments and questions. Is there anybody else who would like to say or ask something at this point? Please raise your hand.
Hi, hello, here I am. My name is, can everyone hear me? Yeah, my name is Ian. And yeah, I'm really happy to have learned about what's going on in India. Thanks very much for that. And I'm wondering, like, with the rise of the far right in Europe recently, it's clear that there's the triggering of one of the major triggering events was the arrival of large numbers of refugees back in 2015. But what's the event in India would be equivalent to that? Like, what triggered it happening, or was it really just the rise of the far right in Europe and America triggering that happening in India too? No particular local event.
It's an interesting question. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that kind of push back a little bit at the idea that the refugee crisis was really the kind of, I suppose it was a kind of diagnostic event for how bad things were in Europe with respect to kind of, I think they were primed to, despite the fact that many hadn't experienced any kind of migration at all, they were kind of willing to immediately pick up xenophobic perspectives. So I see that as a little bit more of a diagnostic event than the event that really triggered all the xenophobia. But I mean, that aside, I think it's an interesting question to think about what precipitated that in India. And of course, this is, they've won a second term, the current Hindu far right party. And really, I mean, there's a kind of wide variety of explanations about why they came to power. One has been, of course, anti-incumbency. The kind of ruling Congress party had been in power for 2 terms at the point at which the BJP won for the first time. There were kind of a few corruption scandals that broke out. I think one of the kind of main explanations that's been given is that the BJP has always, I mean, this is the far-right Hindu nationalist party, that the BJP has always invested in national English language news media. And it's not something that other parties ever actually took very seriously, because most parties relied on kind of either regional or local news sources to get their kind of information across. And the assumption was that it was only the kind of urban, affluent class that actually watched, or that got their news and information from TV. And one of the kind of interesting statistics was that a kind of critical mass of people had switched essentially media consumption at the time, kind of essentially between the last term of the Congress and the first term of the BJP, and had switched to TV news. And that's something that and not just English language, but certainly like national news. And that's something that the BJP invested in quite heavily. And so I think media and their kind of investment in the kind of national media sources and relying on the idea that this demographic shift would happen was one of the really big, I think for the first time we saw an election that was fought in the kind of American PR style. I mean, it was actually Obama's firm, Obama's PR firm, and the same one that kind of worked to get Obama in power for his second term, that worked for Narendra Modi's campaign. And I think it was the first example of a campaign that was kind of really run at that register. And I don't think any of the other parties have really kind of caught on to that. So it's a culmination of things, but I think, yeah, so that was definitely, I think, how they initially began to consolidate power.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that. I have, if there's nobody else wants to ask a question, I have a little question. Is there anybody else at this point? Okay, so there are no hands. So for me, the question is going back to Corona, unfortunately, but I think it's quite pertinent in that obviously with the Corona pandemic, a lot of countries have shut their borders, and some have reacted to that much more quickly than others. And some, I guess, probably relish the chance to close their borders as quickly as possible throughout, I can speak from my personal experience with the Polish government. I'm sure we're quite happy about the fact that now get to organize chartered flights for our citizens to come home and the way that they announced their border closures was very much, in the context of we can't allow anybody into our country to infect our citizens. It was quite toxic nationalistic language. But what I was going to ask about is, or see if you guys have thoughts on this as to why you think the UK and actually Germany they haven't actually really closed the borders. I mean, the EU has as a whole now, and I actually don't know if that now involves the UK or not. I imagine maybe yes, because we're still in the transition period. But why they were so slow off the mark with that? Because of course, in Germany, I guess they've been quite they're doing things quite step by step. They're trying to kind of psychologically get us used to the situation that we are going to be living through more and more restrictions, and they're going to last longer and longer, or longer than we think each time that something new gets announced. But there's obviously kind of a hesitation to go really hard on this. And actually, I feel like it was the same, or my feeling is it was similar in the UK, whereas in India, I think they close things very quickly. But I don't know if you guys have thoughts on how they're handling this kind of very particular border issue. And especially I'm kind of interested in Antony's perspective on the UK here.
I can say something about that. So I mean, from Boris Johnson's, I mean, not from Boris Johnson's perspective, I'm not in his head, but from what I've seen from his perspective is he's very much tried to follow that sort of Donald Trump line of kind of let's try and ignore the problem so that it doesn't seem as if we're handling it and it's not a major deal and we can just carry on business as usual. So it doesn't have that sort of major effect on the stock markets that it ended up having. And this was the sort of thing that Trump was trying to do so that the stock markets didn't crash. This was something that Boris Johnson was absolutely willing to do as well. And I think if you look at every single element of how these sort of new suggestions have came about, because none of it has been a sort of requirement at any point that people self-isolate, or that any of the sort of requirements of any other European countries. In Britain, it seems to they've always been suggestions at this point, because there's been that constant idea of keep calm and carry on, which is essentially Boris Johnson's way of putting profit before people, which he's done at sort of every element of this. And it's not just in avoiding shutting the borders, it's also in making sure that that private business is sort of put in front of public business in terms of like the healthcare. I think it's 2.4 million pounds a day is spent on renting out private hospital beds to the NHS, which is like a massive amount of money, which could be changed in like a heartbeat if he just suddenly was to turn around and say, actually, they should all be nationalised now. That's obviously not in his interest. In his interest is keeping his friends in private industry sort of in his back pocket. So I think this entire thing has been ideological. It's not about shutting the borders for because he couldn't wait to shut the borders or whatever. It's because he wanted to calm the situation down and make it seem as if capitalism could carry on through this. I mean, at the same time, he had that whole idea about herd immunity, which I thought was absolutely absurd. And really happy that it was disproven so quickly by so many like leading scientists and different people in mainstream media, because this idea about herd immunity, he was saying if we get, you know, a certain percentage of the UK population to contract the disease, then we'll build a natural immunity to it, which means that the next time that it comes around, the next wave of coronavirus, will be stronger and we'll be able to deal with it. And this is like absolutely absurd, because without having a vaccine to vaccinate a mass section of the population, there is no ability to actually develop a herd immunity. So all he was really doing is saying, your lives are dispensable and profit matters more than you matter. And that was essentially what he said in his speech when he came out and said, you know, some of you will die, and we'll just have to deal with that. And I think that's been his ideology throughout this entire thing, to sort of look down on people and say, our profits matter more than your lives.
I'll just, you know, kind of quickly add something to that. I think, like, of course, I completely, again, I think you're spot on with, you know, I mean, if you look at the way Bolsonaro is kind of very annoyed by the fact that, oh, this kind of lockdown means that we have to kind of compromise on our markets and essentially on profits and so on. And I do think that, especially at the kind of beginning of this crisis, corporate priorities have seemed to take precedence over public health. But I just wanted to add, you know, as you were saying, you know, you were saying that there's a certain kind of glee with which borders are being shut down, and there's this kind of real, at some level, almost a resurgence of borders and a certain kind of xenophobic. And you know, Anthony was mentioning earlier that this is going to disproportionately affect refugees stuck in camps outside, well, on the borders of Europe and so on, but also within, right? But one of the things I find interesting to kind of, why is Europe the epicenter of the coronavirus epidemic right now? It's because the people that took this, the people that carried, the people that have really been responsible for the spread haven't been migrants, they've been tourists, right? And that's, I think, something to kind of keep in mind, because of the ways in which it undermines this notion of the radical distinction between tourism, which is about mobility and economic prosperity, and migration, which is about desperation and supposedly economic loss. And I think that this idea of kind of closing down borders, and one of the, I think we should be very clear that some of the victims of this are going to be those on the margins trying to get in or out. And so I think, strangely enough, so a lot of places have closed their borders but are letting kind of like, you know, their own citizens come in, which I mean, I have no issues with that. But it's interesting to me that they're more interested to use this moment to keep kind of global South others out than they are to actually evaluate the truth, which has been that this is the kind of primary way in which, the kind of mode in which this is spread is through kind of the privilege of mobility with rich white tourists who've kind of traveled all over and then brought it back to Europe. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when kind of confronting the inevitable snowballing of this discourse into kind of anti-immigrant xenophobic discourse.
Thank you both. I just wanted to quickly say that while absolutely true that it being spread out of Europe is to do with white European tourists, and I absolutely agree that is something that should be talked about more and looked at more, because it is to do with this kind of monetary privilege that Europeans have. There is, I guess, has been quite underreported, but the reason that it became so big in Europe in the first place is because also to do with capitalism, also to do with the terrible conditions that actually migrants are kept in, is that there is the importance of the Made in Italy fashion label actually means that there are effectively sweatshops that exist in northern Italy, and many of them are, well, in fact, I think all of them are full of illegal Chinese workers who had actually just come back to Italy after Chinese New Year. And because they're undocumented, working in terrible conditions, and effectively it's unknown that they're there, the Italian government did not even react, which is why actually it spread so quickly and so kind of hazardously, and that's why it's so deathly in that part of the region. And from there, obviously, it was uncontrolled because they would have had to admit they have these workers there in the first place. So I think there's also another side of things which is exactly what we're talking about with the refugee camps, that in places where migrants or refugees are placed in terrible conditions, are effectively undocumented, and their consent for their lives is effectively nothing, because we don't, they didn't care, they didn't react until this virus was being spread to Italians, but they, which is completely outrageous. The same way that there was no reaction to what's going on in the refugee camps in Greece. So it's the kind of, it's all part of the same thing of like whose lives matter more. And of course it is in the end when the decision making is of the European states, is going to be not the migrants, not the people that we've been treating like shit to, pardon my language, like treating very badly, to keep the capitalist system that we so love going. Their lives don't matter at all. And so I think that ties in very well with what we were saying about, who's the kind of privilege that we have and exert, and who actually has the right to access to any sort of help. So that was just a little thing I wanted to add. I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to say something. Tom, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to say something about coronavirus and then ask a question about how we move forward. What I wanted to say is that from the media that I've been reading, I haven't seen the far right and the ideas and the nationalists try to capitalize on this that much. I feel like much of the mainstream discourse that we've heard so far has been the government says this, and perhaps we hear from some scientists as well. But when I went to watch Angela Merkel's speech, not the one she did yesterday, but the one a few days ago, I typed in Angela Merkel address to the nation onto Google, and the first result that came up was Russia Today had uploaded the video to their YouTube channel in English, and it came up for me because I had English as my language set, and this was fine. I mean, Russia Today had not done anything bad to the video itself, but the really scary thing was that when you watched this video on YouTube, you could see the comments that people had made while it was being broadcast live on Russia Today. And I think, Russia Today has a certain audience on the far right as well as on the left and other kind of alternative viewpoints. And people, in this chat were saying, oh, why should we be listening to Merkel about this? She's the one who opened the floodgates, which obviously is complete non sequitur to try to make this connection between, not closing the borders in 2015 and coronavirus. But it made me think that at some point, I feel like the far right is going to try to mobilize arguments around coronavirus. And, if we're all still in lockdown at that point, it's going to be very much online. It's going to be very much through whatever channels people are using at that point. So to bring this to my question, I mean, obviously, I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on what has the far right started already, but when they do, if and when they do, can we even start to think about how we mobilize against that now? Because Saturday was the International Day of Action Against Racism. I think we didn't really have time to adapt what we were going to do on that day to the situation. So maybe we need more time. But do you have any ideas for how we can actually organize against this?
Oh yeah,
Something.
lunatics. Forgive me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one because I guess it's a sort of period of organization, which I know that I've definitely never experienced. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced that sort of situation where we're not really able to gather together. I mean, I guess there is the possibility of gathering together in a very organized way where we stay a certain amount of distance from each other, and maybe that can perform some sort of powerful statement. But most of this now is going to be online. I haven't seen the far right make any attempts to capitalize on this in an organized way. There's definitely, like you said, comments online and on different feeds and videos and so on, and that's the sort of stuff that I've been seeing. But nothing from actual organised far-right parties that are saying, or nothing that I've seen anyway, it's entirely possible there is, to say that, you know, this is the fault of refugees and migrants and so on. And I think it's going to be, yeah, just something that we have to sort of learn as we go ahead. Like, this is the first one of these that I've ever done. And I know that we're going to have like plenty more of them and stuff in the future. And I think it's recognizing that the internet isn't, you know, just a luxury or something like that, or a commodity, but it's actually a tool that we need to use in a much more robust way in order to carry on sort of organizing in ways which we haven't really done in recent years. And I think this is something we just need to sort of evolve with.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think, you know, one question is certainly ideological. You know, it's about, well, how are people going to capitalize this? You know, how are they going to link this to migrants and, you know, to race and, you know, all of that stuff. But I think the other question is also technological. And so, you know, I mean, I think everyone knows about the kind of way that multiple states have been using, but certainly here in Germany as well, with telecom kind of providing GPS location data for states to kind of figure out whether people are really staying home and to figure out how people are moving around and what measures need to be taken. And, you know, at some level, it's almost, you know, absolutely we need, you know, we're going to have to concede to a certain extent that these kinds of new technologies can probably help us in this moment, and they need to be used, which to a certain degree are understandable. But I think we need to also be extremely careful about the way we kind of voice a very kind of, you know, a considered position on this, where, you know, we have to make sure that that doesn't then become that this moment doesn't then become the kind of entry point for states to be able to use technologies like this to kind of surveil better and monitor better and so on. So I think that there has to be, at some level, I think also a conversation about how to ensure that the state doesn't fundamentally transform into a more technocratically inaccessible one. And we have to kind of figure out how we might make sure that those kinds of, so something like telecom giving the German state access to kind of GPS location data, how we ensure that that kind of is really something that's temporary and doesn't then become another tool that the state's able to use.
Great, thank you for that. Is there anybody else who would like to say something, ask a question? Please raise your hand now. Okay, since there's nobody, is there anything that our speakers would like to say? Oh, Phil wants to speak. Go ahead, Phil.
Sorry, I was waiting to see if there's anyone else wanted to say something who hadn't spoken. I want to say something that's maybe controversial about lockdown. I am absolutely as horrified as anybody about the corona parties, about the pictures of people in Britain, Australia on the beach, and we're in a situation where people are endangering not just themselves but other people. I think this is partly a result that it's partly from a healthy reaction that people don't trust the governments anymore, and particularly in Britain, where the government's information on coronavirus has been contradictory, and so people either just don't believe in things, or at the very least don't know what to think, and are doing things which endanger themselves, which has led to a lot of people, for very good reasons, to say, okay, right, we need a lockdown now, we need an enforced lockdown. I think we've got a problem there, because the question is, who is it who will actually physically enforce this? I mean, we've talked already about the way in which state racism encourages other races, where it's what Modi says, it's the Indian police looking the other way, which has encouraged the anti-Muslim pogroms. It's been the British government deporting Windrush people, which has fueled racism. And I think if we are going to have German police and army people enforcing the people stay at home, these are the same people you see in the U-Bahn or on the street corners who are stopping groups of young people, almost always people with dark skin. And I think we need to be very careful what we call for, what we wish for, and the feeling. Yes, we need some sort of control to prevent the disease spreading can very, very quickly lead to very authoritarian, racist attacks on specific groups of people. I think we can't leave it hanging around, but I do think we really should put a much bigger focus on education, letting people look. This is what's going to happen. And the moment we open the floodgates and saying, okay, let's bring the police and the army onto the streets to control people, this is very dangerous waters.
Do our speakers want to say anything to that? No?
No, I mean, I agree with everything that Phil said. I don't know if I would have anything else to add to it.
All right, looks like, thanks for that, Phil. Anybody else want to say something, or do our speakers want to have some final words? If not?
I've got like a final thing that I can sum up on to sort of come back to the question of citizenship and borders and that sort of stuff. Because when it comes to it, there's sort of throughout all of this, there's always one rule for us and one rule for them. In terms of, poor people, migrants, refugees, and so on, passports, for example, cost money. They can be lengthy processes with racist controls and language barriers full of needless bureaucracy. If you're an immigrant, your worth is based on how productive you can be, how healthy you are, whether or not you have money. And visas can be incredibly difficult to obtain, especially if you don't have a job which pays like a certain amount or is able to support your application and so on. However, the wealthy are able to move around the world and apply for dual nationality and so on with much greater ease. In the UK, for example, they have what's called a golden visa, which allows you to live and work for up to 5 years with virtually no processing time, which costs thousands of pounds, which you can only really buy if you have that sort of money to burn, which essentially just reinforces that idea of if you're a wealthy migrant, you're welcome. But if you're someone who genuinely needs to come to a different country to live and find a place to work, or if you're fleeing war, poverty, anything, you're never going to have that same sort of access. We can even look at the example of current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was an American citizen until only a few years ago. And the only reason he renounced his citizenship was so that he could avoid paying US taxes when he sold his house in North London, which I think is like a massive scandal. And he talks about immigrants and stuff like this when he himself has changed his nationality so that he can avoid taxes, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. But while there's a record number, there is a record number this year of wealthy individuals buying golden visas. There's also a record number of poor refugees, migrants drowning in the Mediterranean because of racist border controls and nationalism focused around citizenship and European values. And I think the only way that we can really sort of end this is through a socialist, borderless world that can sort of break all of that open.
I guess I'll say like a kind of quick thing to sum up as well. I think that, one of the things that I'd like to say, I think there's a tendency sometimes to look at right-wing ideology as simplistic or superficial, and to therefore not take seriously the ideological work happening in the kind of background. And I think one of the things that I would say, at least, the way that I read what's going on in India right now, that one of the things we need to be doing is really kind of getting in there and looking at, what kinds of strategies the right is using, because I think if we in our minds kind of think of them as simplistic, then we do ourselves a certain kind of disservice with respect to our own ability to kind of respond. And one of those kind of larger shifts, and this is also to echo something that Antony was saying a little earlier, with the record number of migrants that have been drowning in the Mediterranean, is I think there is this new kind of era of violence where in Europe that's how it works. You punish ship captains that try to rescue refugees that are drowning in the Mediterranean. In the US-Mexico border, you build the border such that you force people through the most dangerous parts of the desert if they do decide to try, so that the desert takes care of them. And I think there's a certain element to that emerging in India today as well, where I think that's a role that's going to that the detention camps are going to play. There's this kind of big question of, well, what happens if 100 million people end up in detention camps waiting to be deported to where? And I think one of the responses to that is that, well, in all likelihood, they're either going to try to flee in some ways. It's going to, and in the process endanger themselves, or that the camps will kind of, through negligence, do the work that mobs were earlier, charged with. And so I just, just to kind of finish, I also want to say, I think one of the remarkable things, despite the fact that the BJP has tried to kind of split this up by using the NRC and CAA, I think the goal really was to be able to avoid criticism. So every time you say, well, what about the NRC? They say, well, we have the CAA, and then you kind of try to press them on the CAA, and they tell us it has nothing to do with the NRC. And this is this kind of double speak that we're constantly hearing from them. But I think the really remarkable thing has been the kind of protests that we've seen over the last 2 months, especially with respect to the people that have been leading them, who've mostly been women and mostly Muslim women. And so we have this kind of really remarkable moment where people have seen through what you would imagine to have been a fairly kind of sophisticated facade. And I think that's kind of, it's really encouraging to know that kind of political mobilization is still possible, and that despite what we think in terms of the control of media ideology on kind of populations and so on, that there are still ways out, and that and people are actually far more effective at seeing through those kinds of facades than sometimes we acknowledge. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for your great inputs and for sharing your knowledge and experiences. I think it was a very interesting meeting, and I hope everybody who's still here also really enjoyed it. Oh, there's a message. Oh, great. Thanks. And so in terms of any future meetings, we have a couple of organizing meetings coming up in case anybody wants to get more involved in what we're doing. And then our next meeting, which is, we don't know if it's going to happen in this format or whether it's going to happen in real life, but it will happen either way on the 27th of April, and we'll be talking about social movements in Latin America. So yeah, thank you all for being here, and see you online at some other point. And thank you to our speakers again, and for Tom for organizing for dealing with the technology. And yeah, I hope you all keep healthy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.